And let's not forget to ask the question, does the value even resonate with you? Because if somebody is like, this just no longer applies to me or to us as our company, and here's why, like as leaders, we need to kind of heed that advice and really think about, okay, what does make sense to us?
Well, so thank you for everybody who is the virtual event here today. This is the Startup Mastermind show. Basically what this is designed for leaders, executives at startup companies. We are addressing the biggest pain points, the issues that are keeping you up at night. We've surveyed hundreds of leaders in the space, and one of the themes that was just constantly coming up, or several of the kind of biggest themes were related to company culture. Something like 75-80% of the folks that I had surveyed were really focused on how can we address company culture, how can we create a company culture where our employees are thriving, and any number of different pieces to that. So we've got an expert on the topic with us today. Hema Crockett, thank you very much for joining. So for those of you who don't know Hema, she is a entrepreneur, author, avid traveler, has spent about 20 years as an HR executive, has worked in the private sector, in government, and is the co-founder of Gig Talent, which is a modern talent collective that we will talk about here today at the end of the call. But Hema's been published in several high-profile magazines, Forbes, Thrive Global, co-authored two books which I have read, Designing Exceptional Organizational Cultures and The Everyday Leader. So Hema, thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, for having me. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kick things off here, so you pretty adventurous person. So the first chapter of your book, you're talking about climbing up to Mount Everest base camp. So how was that?
Yeah, life altering to say the least. It wasn't one of those items for me that ever showed up on a bucket list or a thing I had to do, but life led me to living in Kathmandu, Nepal for a couple of years. And I thought, well, I'm here. Before I leave, I'm going to do this. And that's exactly what I did.
Pretty wild. That's definitely not the first thing you think of when you think of somebody in HR, right?
Not even close. Not even close. But, I have to tell you, the lessons that I learned up there, I didn't really put together, if you will, until a few years later, right? When you're back in the grind, when you're back in a company kind of day-to-day living, whether it's culture or leadership or just life, quite frankly. I still to this day, it's been now 10 years, I still to this day kind of go back to that time in my life and think about the lessons that I had standing there.
Yeah. Well, take us through that. So where were you before that experience? Where did that leave you? Where did that lead you? What was that trajectory like in this experience and just in your career to this point today?
Yeah, well, to be fully transparent, I wasn't one of these people who knew exactly what I wanted to do or be when I grew up. And so I remember entering college and thinking, I want to be a forensic psychologist for the FBI. And I think there were like 5 at the time in the world. And it was probably because there was some, cool TV show on at the time. And I really thought the job was amazing. And then I realized how much school you had to go through to actually do that job, not to mention all the tests and if I would even pass, then what happens? Yeah. And I think like many of us, we kind of get thrown in different directions when we're in college. And I kept with a psychology major, and I just decided I really loved business as well, the more business classes I was taking. So I ended up with a psychology and business degree and an emphasis in international business. Cool. And, as luck would have it, sadly, the world had kind of gone crazy at the time, and we were just entering Iraq and going to war, and the Twin Towers had just collapsed, and there weren't really a lot of opportunities. So it didn't matter necessarily what I wanted to do. It was a little bit more about what was available at that point in time. And so I grew up in Arizona, went to school in Arizona at the University of Arizona, and was recruited for a company out of Los Angeles. So packed up, moved, and that company was eventually, or my position there was eventually laid off, I should say. And my career has been a series of what I term pivots, right? You and I talked
Yeah.
about this a couple of weeks back. There's that Friends episode of Ross trying to get the couch up the stairs. I think I sent you the link on that.
Yeah.
And it's just been pivoting a lot of different things. And I think ultimately it was about what led me to this point today in my life. And so before going to Everest, I had a great career. Actually, I was working at a brokerage company. It was not anything that I saw myself doing long term. I was working really closely with a lot of HR departments, especially in the biotech space, and was really an extension of their HR team.
Yeah.
And had learned a lot about HR. And then just through life circumstances, quite frankly, led my husband and I to decide we just wanted to try something different. And he was active duty military at the time, got this amazing assignment overseas, and we just decided, when else are we going to have this opportunity? So
Oh, yeah.
I decided, sure, I can put my career on hold. Really, it's an adventure. Let's do this. I'm not going to say no to something so amazing as that experience. And that's really what led me to kind of work with the State Department, the Department of Justice for a couple of years as well. So we were in Kathmandu for a couple of years, and then moved over to Berlin for a couple of years. So just had a nice experience really living in very different countries,
Yeah.
traveling the world and kind of seeing culture, not as we think of it in terms of a company, but really as we think of it in terms of life, seeing how business is conducted in other parts of the world, how people communicate in other parts of the world. And then when I came back to the US, just dove head first, right back into life, basically, and joined a biotech, really running their benefits program, their total rewards program, and was really figuring out what I wanted to do, right? Still, like, what was that sweet spot that I loved doing? And over the course of the next few years, realized I love the build. I love building
Yeah.
HR teams. I love building the infrastructure. How do we scale an organization? How do we think about these things as we grow and scale? And, over the course of the next about decade or so, had this opportunity to really work in some amazing startups, tech, biotech, fintech, building these not only HR teams, but really thinking about what culture we wanted to build and what aspects of kind of the small company feel we wanted to keep as we grew and really, quadrupled in size, which was one of the last companies I was with when I was in house.
Yeah.
And about 5 years ago, decided I'm done. I'm done working for somebody else. I'm done kind of just focusing on one company, and talk about a major life pivot, right? I think back to that time on Everest, and I think about what were those lessons that were really important to me. And it was, how do I build something that's bigger than myself? And so
Nice.
I was fortunate enough to stay in contact with a close friend and colleague who we had worked together previously. We were on our separate journeys and decided, let's come back together and let's build whatever that thing is. And that's really how Gig Talent came about.
Yeah. Fantastic. And that's Jamie Jacobs. So that's your
It
co-author.
is. It is. Yeah. Co-author and co-founder and good friend as well.
That's great. It's always good to have somebody that's been there with you for multiple stages of your life, and that and trust to that level. I mean, that's few and far between. If you're lucky, you have a few of those.
So
Yeah.
true. And especially when you go into business with somebody,
Oh
right?
yeah.
It's like you're really, your families are getting married for lack of a better term, because everything is intertwined at that point and you spend so much time together. So what was nice is that we knew how each other worked. We knew how each other thought. And I think going into this type of a partnership, that is really beneficial.
Oh yeah. 100%. I mean, you can be friends with somebody, and I mean, they say don't go into business with your friends, because if it doesn't work out, and it usually won't, that
Right.
that's not
Right.
always
We're
a good
5 years
thing.
in, we're going strong.
Well, good. I think that's a good marker to make
Right.
it to. So your two books. So what inspired you to write those?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for reading those. I never, again, just like Everest, I never thought I would write a book. be an author, let alone write 2 books. So the first book that we released, Jamie and I wrote together, and that's called Designing Exceptional Organizational Cultures. And really the reason behind that book was, how do we take our experiences, which are varied, right? We have a lot of startup, but we also have a lot of really established company experience. And how do we take what we've learned, the lessons learned, both positive and ones that we probably don't want to repeat again, and bring it forth so that other people can learn from all of that as well? I mean, a lot of times we think, we need to hire somebody to help us with X. But at the end of the day, there's so many things that we as business leaders and business owners can do ourselves. And so that was really the genesis behind that culture book. Was it's almost a blueprint, if you will, or a framework on how to create these environments where employees want to be.
Yeah.
Right? We take apart a lot of things. I mean, we start with leadership, then we go into a lot of things around the employee value proposition. We talk about DE&I, total rewards, learning and development. And then we kind of bring it back together on you as an individual, you as a leader. How are you showing up day to day for all of those things for your team? And so the genesis there was a little bit different actually than the second book, which is The Everyday Leader. And, you laugh about going into business with your friend. This second book was co-authored. My husband's the co-author.
Yeah.
And so writing a book with your spouse is just a totally different experience altogether. And I would say it was so fun to write this book with him. We decided early pandemic, actually, I think it was probably April, May of 2020. What we started noticing is we were getting a lot of calls in our business for things like, I need a coach, or my leadership team needs help on how to, lead in a remote environment, how to connect with employees, right? Like it was a huge deal. We were seeing it everywhere. And it was that point where we were like, my husband and I just got to talking about the difference in leadership between what we see in the business world and what he was seeing in the military. And by that time he had retired, but what he was seeing in the military, and he retired after 23 years, and how leadership is taught from day one. Right? You're 18 years old, you're just enlisting or joining the military for the very first time, and you're already put into leadership positions, and you're already making really good decisions, and you're already thinking about, how do I lead and how do I make those decisions? But in the business world, it's like you have to be chosen, right? You have to be chosen for that high potential, high performing training class, or nominated. Why don't we teach everybody how to show up as a leader? And so that's what that second book is really about. It's, taking the 14 Marine Corps leadership traits and applying them to not only business, but each of us just every day in our everyday lives, how you show up, whether you're, your kid's soccer coach, whether you're a CEO, whether you're on the PTA, whatever it is. How can we show up as a leader regardless of our level, title, role, rank, whatever it may be?
Yeah, I love that. And the thing in organizations too is, people get promoted a lot of times based on their performance in an individual contributor role, and that's not necessarily, going to translate. But just love that concept in general. It's about personal responsibility. It's, taking leadership in your own life. But yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's around like democratizing leadership. Right?
Yeah.
Not leaving it up to an organization to decide this is how you're a leader here when we nominate you. It's taking, exactly to your point, this ownership, this personalization of who am I as a leader. Yeah,
that's great. So as far as, the remote culture piece, so that's something that, came up actually multiple times when I was talking with folks about this show here, and what was on the minds of leaders and startups that I'm working with. So what advice would you give to somebody who did ask that question? It sounds like you got that question a lot. How do I lead in a remote culture? How can I continue to build my culture when everybody is remote?
Yeah. I think the first piece of advice is really what you did before, realize it may or may not work. Right? Don't just go in with the assumption that nothing is going to change, that we've always done things this way and we don't have to shift anything just because everybody is remote. That is probably the wrong way to go into it. What I would say is kind of, for starters, dig deep into your values. And this will probably be a little bit of a theme in a couple of these questions because,
Yeah.
or just in this dialogue, because the truth is, like, our values really serve as those anchors, right? And so as we switch from kind of a face-to-face culture to more of this remote or hybrid, how do we want to interact with people? How do we want to make decisions? How do we want to communicate? How do we want to promote people? What do we want from our leaders? And it's asking all of those questions rather than making the assumptions. And then really thinking about it in terms of rethinking or redesigning your kind of employee value proposition, right? What employees used to find super meaningful no longer applies. And so before just kind of pushing everybody remote and just saying, you know, we're figuring it out and we'll try to make it work, ask the question of what are the tools that you need to be effective, right? To either lead in a remote environment or to perform in a remote environment. We're seeing a lot of people get really creative, right? So there's like no meeting Fridays, which is really kind of cool, or no meetings on certain mornings so that people can really focus on their work.
Yeah. See, that's that big one, right? Is there's, you know, these Zoom calls they're draining. You know, you can't do a bunch of these in a row. It's like they're more exhausting than talking to somebody in person for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to mention we get no break, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we complained about this when we were in person, where it was you go from one conference room to the next or one meeting room to the next. Zoom calls are really no different. And in fact, you don't even have a chance to get up and walk. You just sit in your same chair for the next, 6 to 8 hours of just call after call after call. So is that really what you want your culture to be? So that's kind of the crux of that. Like, how do you, think about culture? What does remote culture look like? Do you want somebody glued to their computer, glued to their chair for 8 hours a day?
Well, that's how you burn out your employees, and that's how you get your employees, looking for another job because their company culture sucks.
Yeah, or picking up that call, right? I mean, there's a reason why they chose to answer the call when a headhunter calls.
Yeah, that's why they're gonna return my in-mail.
Right.
That's good for me, not for you.
You'll get a credit back. That's all that means.
That's right. That's right. And I do love what you said too about leaning into the values too, your core values, because you think about you're in an office setting. Ideally, it's not a situation where you're being micromanaged, but the values just take on an added importance when you're not around other people. Where if you have those values ingrained in your head, you're going to make the right decisions. Even when there aren't people watching. So it's like, what's the old saying? It's, your character is what you do when nobody's watching. That's who you really are.
Right.
That's really where that, comes into play.
Totally. And I think as organizations, what's important is to how do you bring those values to life, right? How do you put an action behind what they mean rather than just a word? Right. So, a lot of times integrity or honesty tends to be an action, but value. But what does that actually look like? What does that mean for me in my job, or delivering with quality? What does that mean for me in my job so that I can relate it back to what I'm sitting here doing day in and day out?
So how do you advise, people that you're working with on that? How do you advise bringing your values to life?
Yeah. I think it's a really critical thing for every organization to go through, especially younger organizations who are probably growing and changing at a rapid pace as it is, right? Because every new hire you bring in, your culture is changing right then and there. Culture is fluid. It's not this kind of stagnant or stale.
They're building the culture, right?
Yeah.
That's a few clients that I work with say, I ask them, what's your company culture like? And they say, well, these hires, they're going to be a part of shaping it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think the way you bring those values to life is, you don't disregard what you've done today. Every company has a culture, period. Good or bad, doesn't matter. Every company has a culture. And what you do is you think about the people and talk to the people who have been there from day one, who have been there a really long time that you want to retain as you continue to grow. And you almost form kind of these small focus groups, right, of people. And you ask, how do you bring these values to life? What do they mean to you? How does this show up? And really, it's about crowdsourcing the input from your
Mm.
employees who have to live those values. And let's not forget to ask the question, does the value even resonate with you? Because if somebody is like, this just no longer applies to me or to us as our company, and here's why, like as leaders, we need to kind of heed that advice and really think about, okay, what does make sense to us? And then to bring that back from a leader perspective and think about how do we put those into action, right? How do we base our decisions off of those values? How do we base our hires off of those values? And how
Yeah.
do we bring those values into every aspect of our organization so that they serve as, again, that foundation or that anchor point for us?
Yeah. So one thing I found very interesting in what you just said there was how values might change as a company grows. So, a lot of the companies I work with are early stage startups. So, it's things change very quickly and the amount of people you're working with changes very quickly. You know, what advice would you give to a company in that regard? So as you're growing, like how do you know when it's time, when you maybe have outgrown your values, and just generally speaking, like how should I think about that as a leader, as I'm
Yeah,
going through this journey?
yeah, it's a great question. I think that if you don't have values today, right? If you're just beginning on that journey and you don't have values today, or I should say you don't have written down values, because I think there's actually unspoken values that a company has, but they may
Yeah,
not actually acknowledge and write them down anywhere.
sure.
So I would say probably to start formalizing what that is for starters, right? And as you think about those values, what are the things that you want to make sure you hold on to as you continue to grow? What are those
Hmm.
non-negotiables? Right? And I actually think of as individuals when we're considering, I often tell people this too when they're interviewing for jobs. Right? What are your non-negotiables? What are those values that are so important to you that no matter where you go, you will not give them up? Works the
Yeah,
same way in a company, right? Maybe are there 2 to 3 values that you're like, I'm not giving those up. As we grow, those aren't changing. Those become the bedrock. Then think about where you are today. What's important? Is innovation important? Is agility important? Is kind of speed of delivery important? So think about what is important today and then define those things, because we know that things like agility, while it's an important value, it means one thing to a startup today. It
hmm,
means that we are constantly shifting, that we are actually trying to figure out what our footing is, both from an internal and external market perspective as well.
yeah,
And as we grow and scale, agility can start to shift. It may no longer be the most important thing to us versus like speed to delivery becomes more important to us versus the agility aspect. So that's how I would break up kind of what are the non-negotiables and what are the things that you think, we could trade based on what our circumstances are at that time.
sure. So you almost have, your, let's say, two or three that are your bedrocks. These are going to be with you for the life of the company. And then you have maybe one or two that are, circumstantial based on where we are in our,
Yeah,
life cycle. These are the ones we're going to
absolutely.
reevaluate.
Yeah. And the big key is what you just said, reevaluate,
Hmm.
right? It's okay to, every year, let's come back to those values. Are we still aligned with them? Do we still, especially if you're growing, if you're
Yeah.
adding, 50 or 100 people per year, your culture is definitely changing. So let's come
Hmm.
back to those values and see, like, do they still apply? Do they still align with who we are and who we want to be and where we're going? And if not, okay, let's be intentional about sitting down and rewriting what those need to look like.
Yeah. 100%. Well, let's shift gears to building that team. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
hiring, that's what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. That's what I'm helping people with. Um, and you know, that's such a critical part of what your culture is going to be, is who you bring on, who you bring onto your team as you grow, right? So they're the ones who are potentially shaping it, and really are inevitably shaping it, right? It's the people that you hire. Um, and so one thing, this is one of the first things I do whenever I take on a new client, for my recruiting business, is understand, why would someone want to work at your company? What is the selling point? And you call that employee value proposition. So you know, what's the reason you work there? Why do you like working there? What are the selling points of working at this company? So Like what makes a good employee value proposition, and how should leaders go about, building those out?
Yeah. For starters, I love those questions. I
Yeah.
love the questions that you ask organizations because the answer to those questions is actually culture. That's what their culture is, right? I often equate this to one question, which is, what's it like to work there?
Hmm.
And how, whatever words people use to describe, you're actually describing the culture. The employee value proposition is almost bringing that culture to life, right? To a degree. So it's really about kind of this almost social contract. Like these are the items that we as an organization are going to give you in return for your discretionary effort, in return for coming to work. And this is deeper than pay. We're not just talking about compensation here. And we talk about this in the culture book a bit, and this is kind of the components of culture that make up this employee value proposition are so key to not only attracting the right talent, but retaining that talent. And so these are things like when you think of something like total rewards, again, we're deeper than just financial, we're deeper than just money and a salary. We're talking about benefits here, right? Is there, the basic benefits? Yes, right? Like medical, dental, vision, some of those things. But what about time off? Is there time I can get away? And is there time for me to recharge? So like, vacation time.
Yeah.
Things like learning and development are a big part of your employee value proposition. How can I grow in my career? How can I get to the next level, both personally and professionally? A lot of times, or I should say recently, over the last couple of years, we're hearing a lot about sustainability efforts, right? And corporate social responsibility. So what good are we doing in the world? How are we minimizing our footprint environmentally, depending on the type of company that we have? What do things like diversity, equity, and inclusion look like for our company? And so this is a lot to tackle if you think about it, especially for a small company like a startup. These are a lot of different areas. And I would say that not all areas are created equal, right? You really have to think about what is most important to your company right at this specific time. I'll say the one thing on your list, the number one thing should always be at least paying a living wage, right? We don't want our employees to be so concerned that they can't pay their bills, they can't, get enough gas in their car to get to work or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to compete and get the people that you need and are looking for if you're not paying at least somewhat competitive. Obviously, these startups aren't going to compete with Amazon and Facebook most of the time, but they compete in other ways. And
they do.
You had mentioned total reward. So I hear that one a lot, actually, related to growth, learning opportunities. That's a good one, I think, when it comes to employee value proposition, is baking that into your culture, is that we're constantly upskilling for engineers, upskilling our our employees, and that's something we value. How have you seen that one specifically with people that you've worked with? Some maybe ways that companies have gotten creative with enabling that for their team.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say it is one of the most important things. And I think when we think about the questions that were asked in interviews, it ranks really high up there, right? Like how do I, it's not about being promoted. It's about how do I keep learning and how do I grow in my role? And I've seen this in a couple of ways, and some companies do a tremendous job at this. One of the things they do, especially in smaller companies, because it's hard to build out anything formal in a small company because you're growing, quite frankly, so rapidly that you're adding new roles all the time as it is. But are there projects or are there certain cross-functional opportunities that you can provide an employee to give them a little bit more scope and to give them a little bit more broader vision of your organization? And maybe they can either lead that project or be a part of that project team and then lead a different one in the future. Those are opportunities actually that most small companies can easily do for their employees. The other, I would say, mid-sized companies that I'm seeing, they start to build out a light version of like a university program, right? Where they may have things like leadership 101, right? Like these are foundational items of how to be a leader, or courageous conversations. How do you have a courageous conversation, which doesn't just apply to leaders or those managing people. It applies to all of us on how do I give and receive feedback. And so some of those types of classes I'm seeing more and more. Now, for smaller companies, I tend to see them outsource some of that type of stuff a bit more and maybe bring in a facilitator once or twice a year to kind of have some of this education. Mid-sized companies, I'm seeing it more that they're building it out internally. They're having a trainer, they hire a trainer, and it's that person's responsibility to kind of keep facilitating those sessions.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, that's definitely, like I said, a big one I've seen, and I've seen companies that have offered, we'll pay for one conference of your choice that's related to what we do in some way every year, or pay for you to get this certification. I work with a lot of tech people. We'll pay for your AWS certification or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, even the tuition reimbursement. Right, has been another aspect of it too. And I think it brings up an important point, which is just also, it's when you talk about your employee value proposition, it's also a great time to look at your job descriptions, in my opinion, to really think about, are all of those requirements on your job description true requirements, right? Or are there certain things in there where do they really need a degree from a 4-year institution? Or what if they have a 2 to 3 certificates that are key to what you need them to do and what you need them to have? Is that okay?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually highlighted the job description, a paragraph about when you were talking about job descriptions in your book, because there's just so many bad ones out there.
I'm sure you see it done.
I did a video. This was not a very good video, but like when I was first starting to do videos for YouTube on HR related stuff, I did a segment called Bad Job Descriptions, and I was like read a few and gave pointers on why they shouldn't do this. But yeah, go check that out. But so what makes up a good job description? Because it really is, it's the first look a lot of times people are going to get at a company. So you never get a second chance at a first impression. What should be in there, and how should people writing those really think about them?
Yeah. First of all, they should be intentional. It shouldn't be, we're just going to pick it up, dust it off because somebody left the role and repost the same job description we posted 4, 5, 6 years ago, right? That should not happen. So let's really take a look at it. What I would say is, just from a holistic perspective, include values. Having your values on your job description will tell a potential candidate, this is who we are, this is what we believe in. Give them a little bit about your culture in there as well. It just doesn't have to be anything lengthy. It can be a couple of sentences just about your culture. And then really look at all of the stuff, the laundry list of items that people put under, job responsibilities. There's like 50 or 60 items listed under this thing. But at the end of the day, are those really all important to the job? I mean, let's think about what we need the person to do. What is critical in this role for them to get done? Not nice to have. Let's start with what we have to have them do in this role.
Yeah. Would you even include the nice to haves on there?
I would include the ones that are probably most important, right? There's a ranking system for the nice to have. And maybe there's a couple of those things which are truly nicer to have than some of the other items. I would include those on there. But when you get this laundry list of honestly, I've seen job descriptions that are 30, 35 bullet points on this thing. Employees and candidates are looking at this and they're thinking, well, I can do 75% of this amazingly, but that 25% I'm never going to be able to do without assistance. So I'm not even going to apply.
Yeah.
We're
lot
losing
of people,
great candidates.
Yeah. A lot of people won't waste their time. I mean, I've had many times where I'll send a candidate a job description and they'll say, no, I can't do this stuff. And I'm like, oh no, trust me. I'm looking at your background and I like you, but it's obviously people don't want to be in a situation where they're not, qualified to do the job well.
Yeah.
But it's,
I would also say the other section is really think about the requirements, right? To what the point that we were just talking about, what is a nice to have? What is a must have? Because a lot of times we just make this assumption that everybody has to have a college degree. And quite frankly, there are people out there who are honestly, college isn't for me, but I have these certificates. I've been amazing at what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I have the experience to do it. And this college degree tends to be the holdback. And again, we don't want to lose great people if they're coming in with the experience that we need them to have. So what is most important to us? Making sure they have a college degree, or making sure they have, let's say it's 10 years of experience doing X.
Yeah.
Right. And let's get realistic about that experience. I mean, is it really 10 years, or are we okay if it's 5 years? Right. Let's ask the questions. Let's again be intentional about it. And let's try to avoid some of these words that people can get caught up in, right? Like must have a can do attitude, must love hustle culture, must, be available 24 hours a day. Like what are we trying to do? Scare away good people?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I think sometimes companies who put those things in there are, it's, if you're not willing to do this, you're going to be expected to work 24/7. You're not for us.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting that too is, I read an article a while back that's less women are significantly less likely to apply for jobs that are, have that type of language, one, and are more likely to not apply if they don't feel like they meet the qualifications. So you've got these companies that have, diversity and inclusion goals, and
Yes.
it's as simple as how they're wording their job description. That's, one of the reasons they're not hitting them.
Yeah, no, it's such a great point, because even if you broaden that, right, just beyond women, not everybody has the same access to the same education,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or the same types of universities or things like that. But if again they have the experience, what is the problem? And
Yeah.
so I think in order to help with a lot of those initiatives, it's going to be really important that we start to peel back what we always thought we should have on a job description and kind of reinvent what makes the most sense for us and our culture, right? It's going to be different for each company based on what they're looking for, but what makes sense to us, not to our competitor, not to, some of these large Amazon, Google, Apple, but to us at our organization. What do we find critical?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I definitely think, if I'm ever asked about it, I'm a proponent of ditch the college degree requirement, because you're just, you're missing out on so many people who can
So many people.
be a rock star for you.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So on the topic of org structure, so this was one of the things I really thought was interesting in your book. How the way your organization is structured, like the hierarchy, the management, just the general org structure, can have an impact on how your culture is, brought to life. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it really falls back to how you make decisions, right? And how your organization works. So most of us are really used to like a functional organizational structure, right? Where we have marketing, we have sales, we have finance, we have HR, we have operations, and we have functional experts in each one. And as we grow and as we scale an organization, we tend to move closer to that type of structure because we're looking for true experts in each of those to help guide us, to lead us, to move us in the right direction. Early on, that may not exist because we're looking for a lot of utility players, and we're looking for people who we just need to either get proof of concept or our first 2 to 3 customers, or if you're biotech, we just need to get lab employees going and really, get in there and start testing and researching and doing what we need.
Yeah, you got to prioritize. I mean, there's a million things to do.
Yeah.
You're not going to get them all done, right?
You're not going to get them all done. And that's okay, because a lot of times we expect that from small startups. We know that when you hire one person, they're probably going to be responsible for operations, maybe a little bit of finance, maybe some payroll, maybe, project management, all these things that come about. But the reason structure is important is because as you start to grow and scale, you have to really think about who has decision-making authority in your organization. And you can't be the only person that is making all the decisions. I mean, don't get me wrong. We've all seen organizations where that literally is happening. It's like the end all be all stops with one person at the end of the day. But if you're like many leaders, you want to understand that you don't know everything, and you want people to be able to make decisions that fall within their purview. And so that structure is really critical to how that decision making happens. What it also allows us to do is think about how we organize ourselves as it relates to our teams, right? Because it can be very difficult. The more we grow and the more functional expertise that we start to get, they're looking for leaders who can actually help them grow in their own careers, who can provide guidance and mentorship to them as well, and who can point them in the right direction. And that doesn't necessarily come from a Jack or Jill of all trades. That comes from a specific functional expert. And so that's why we spent some time in the book talking about it, because we hear a lot of matrix organizations. We hear a lot of, you see it a lot in tech, right? Between product and engineering and how they truly work and function together. And the point of structure comes into play because somebody needs to step up as a leader, and you don't want there to be kind of a tug of war on whose kingdom or fiefdom are we now getting into. And that's what that avoids.
Yeah, it's the extreme on one end is bottlenecks where one person's having to improve everything, and then the extreme on the other end is, we don't know who's necessarily responsible, and you have these, kind of power struggles.
Right, like that holacracy, right? Which is there really is no direct leader. It's kind of a collective decision making.
That sounds like a nightmare, honestly, to me. Like if I was in that structure, that sounds absolutely terrible.
Agreed.
But it must work for some people. But for some people, but not for me. But so if you're in this situation, I mean, and again, this is challenging for a growing startup because it's, who do we hire? Who do we have in our team that could be, that expert at XYZ? Because at the beginning, again, people are, wearing a lot of hats is what it's required. So is that a matter of prioritizing the, business units that are, important, or how would I look at that, deciding whether to make it more of like a dispersed structure, or we need this person in this role who's, like the expert? How would I evaluate the different pieces?
I will say some of it is based on feeling. You'll start to feel a tension. There's just a natural tension that is going to arise as you start hiring certain levels of leaders, right? And the point that we talked about when we started this conversation, that each new employee you bring into your organization is contributing to the culture and it's changing the culture. The same thing happens regarding your org structure. Each new employee that is coming into your organization, especially at higher levels, is actually affecting how you start to look at structure. A lot of structure is going to be based on your business strategy. So, for example, if you don't have right now a sales pipeline or a sales arm, or your product isn't ready to go to market, then that is just a portion of the functional org structure you don't need right now. You don't go and build out your sales function and hire a sales leader at this point in time. So you think about where your business strategy is, and then you hire based on that. A lot of times we tend to see that a CFO is hired pretty early. And in startups, what we see is it's a interim CFO or it's a consultant CFO, right? Somebody who you're not paying full time, fractional. You're not paying them full time, but maybe you're giving them equity in lieu of, a high retainer. So that's where we see a lot from like the CFO side. We see a lot on the HR side that falls into that same bucket. Now we're talking fractional HR. We're talking an HR advisor that kind of works in that same capacity. These aren't people that you're hiring full time. You just know that you need guidance.
Yeah.
The ones that we see early on tend to be true strategy. Like they're part of what the business needs to do in the next 1, 2, 3 years, right? So you're head of research, head of engineering, a head of product, like people who are critical to what you need to accomplish in order to grow and scale at the rate or level that you want to.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So it's really these more, ancillary positions that are, even a recruiter falls into that camp.
It does.
Like,
exactly.
That's why I have a job.
Right. It's same.
These are companies that are just, they don't have the need to have somebody on payroll to do this, but they don't have the time to do it either, and they need that expertise.
And you want it done correctly. right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is the other thing. And what this is where we're now in such a great place from an external market landscape where we do have consultants and we do have the gig economy to allow people to tap into, quite frankly, so that you don't have to increase your overhead. You don't have to have somebody on payroll. You don't have to pay somebody for 40 hours a week when it's maybe a 10-hour a week job.
Yeah.
And so I think we have, and startups have so much more flexibility now than they ever used to then put resources towards what is critical to the business to hire versus what is critical to outsource, and partnering with people who can then provide you with guidance on now it's time that you really need to hire a full-time HR leader, CFO, recruiter, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And, in a perfect world, obviously, you'd rather have all those positions in-house, given the, intimacy or whatever the case may be. But if, again, if you don't have the need for that level of expertise, you have to prioritize your resources.
Yeah.
That flexibility. And, the other thing with consultants too, I mean, some of the largest companies in America are consulting businesses. You think of the big four, these are companies that have experience with hundreds, thousands of other companies that have been in these situations. So it's not just, a one-dimensional view
Yes.
of the problem. It's, it's all the different scenarios. They're pulling
it's the
from all the
benefit.
different experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the benefit of that external lens, that external experience that a consultant can bring.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then, the products that are, or the pieces of your business that are almost like the core of your business, you'd rather them be intimately familiar with your unique, value adds or whatever, the case may be.
Yeah. Until it makes sense, right? To your point,
Yeah.
to hire full time. Absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Well, yeah. So, ultimately, the thing that you write about is comes back to the leader. So that's a common theme of both your books, particularly the second book, but just in general with a lot of the stuff that you talk about. How does that, fit in overall? And what advice would you give to a leader? How do leaders bring it all together with this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even in the culture book, it's actually one of the first chapters we dive into is about culture. I mean, I'm sorry, about leadership and about this aspect of self-awareness, because especially in smaller companies, how a company is led and who you directly report to, while it applies across the board in all companies, right? In smaller companies, there's just less people to cling to. And so how your leader leads and how they make decisions and how they show up every day is critical to how the business is run. It's critical to your experience within that organization. It's critical to, do I recommend this company to a friend? Right? Even if I left, maybe I left because, my spouse is now moving to another country. And would I still want somebody to work for that same leader? Would I still want somebody to work for that same company? Leadership is so foundational to the experience that people have in their organizations. And it is really the support system that the direct leader lends to the employee that makes their not only experience, but the culture of that organization as well. And that's why there's, it's so fundamental to culture. It's so fundamental to how we attract and retain employees.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the business in a way, especially at these early stages, it's like an extension of the leader as a person almost, right?
Right. Because that's the person, right, that you have the most interaction with. And I think if we were all to put ourselves back in, the shoes when we were employees, maybe just starting out early on, and we were thinking about who was either the best leader we ever worked for or the worst leader we ever worked for, it becomes pretty easy to pinpoint all of those things from that worst leader. Right? Yeah. They were rude, they were short, they didn't care, they didn't ask questions, they didn't listen. Like there's this litany of stuff that is so prevalent about why we remember that leader so negatively. And then when we put ourselves in that leader's shoes, we think about, who do I not want to be? And so we take all of those things as we go through our career and try to turn them around. You want to listen, you want to be better. Really, we're looking for a role model. We want to see what great leadership looks like so that we can start figuring out who we are as a leader ourselves.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about gig talent. So we were
Yeah.
talking a little bit about that, in this conversation and before we hopped on the call. So um, tell us a little bit about gig talent, how that got started, and how everything came about, and what the company does.
Absolutely. So, Gig Talent is really a modern talent collective. And what we do is we certify high caliber HR consultants and leadership coaches, and then serve as their business development and marketing arm. And so we're trying to actually solve a couple of problems, which is really how Gig Talent came about in the first place. So there's two sides of it, right? There's the consultant side. And as a consultant, the conversation you and I were having, Brian, were really about how it can be lonely to be
Yeah,
a on this island by yourself. And sometimes you want interaction with other people. You want to be able to bounce ideas off one another. And so what we did is we created a collective. And within that collective, once you become certified through us, you actually have access to each other, quite frankly, and you use them as if they're part of your company to a degree.
hmm
You can bounce ideas off of them. You can ask for assistance. You can just have another person there who's going through something similar to you
yeah.
are.
You've got teammates again.
Teammates, and support. And then we also provide ongoing personal and professional development because it's important that consultants also stay on top of trends and what's going on, and then are able to share what they're great at with other members of the collective. And again, we serve as their business development and marketing arm. So we're out there actively getting them engagements. And we have a lot of actually startups because it doesn't make sense to hire a full time HR leader, but you
Yeah,
have access to the knowledge of, a 12, 15, 20-year HR veteran, and they're not on your payroll full time. So you can tap into this plethora of knowledge across a wide range of industries. And what's important to us is that we vet all of our consultants. This is so that as a company, you know exactly who you're getting. I remember being on the opposite side of this, looking for consultants when I was still in house, and it's a friend of a friend who may do a good job, may not do a good job. You just don't know much about them. And
right.
so let's take the guesswork out of it. These are folks who you're going to give intimate information to about your business strategy, about your hiring plans. You want to make sure that they're vetted. You want to make sure that you can trust who you're getting.
And they're
Um,
giving good advice, right?
Great
Like
advice,
you
exactly.
you're crafting a lot of the things we talked about on this call with
Yes,
companies, right? These
yes,
consultants do.
exactly. And it's a great point because we have quite a few consultants who this is the work that they love to do, which is what's important for the way that we structured Gig Talent. For us, it's really about making sure that people are doing work that they love to do and that's aligned with who they want to be. And that's so that they can deliver on all of those things to an organization. And really, culture, leadership, the employee value proposition, that is all a part of what these consultants love to do day in and day out.
Fantastic. Well, let me. I forgot to load your contact info, so I'm going to share my screen quickly here. Hopefully, this
Perfect.
works okay. All right. Well, there we go. Can you see the contact info?
I can, yes.
Perfect. So for everybody on the call today, if you're looking, if you're interested in what Hema was just talking about related to gig talent, you could use this some extra advice related to really anything we talked about today, right? Those are all in the purview of your consultants.
It is, absolutely. We have consultants that, do anything from HR operations, advise on payroll, systems, all the way to interim HR leaders. So everything in between compensation, total rewards, learning and development. Absolutely. We have executive coaches as well.
Yeah, that's great. And it's a moving target too, right? I mean, this stuff changes quickly,
Absolutely.
and you want to be on the cutting edge so you can be competitive. I mean, that's the bottom line with a lot of this stuff is company culture is a selling point, and if you don't have it figured out, you're gonna miss out.
Yeah, and it's about taking an active role in it, right?
Yeah.
It's about not waiting until there's a quote unquote issue, but
Mm.
making sure that you are active about it and intentional about it so that you can continue building on it in order to attract the really amazing talent that you need to scale and grow or to retain the folks that you currently have today.
Yeah. Be intentional about your culture. That's a
Yep.
good thing to end on, I would say. Well, perfect. We did use the full hour, Hema. I
Awesome.
appreciate the time. This was great. I think there's a lot of great stuff here, and appreciate everyone hopping on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. Really excited about it.
Absolutely. Take care, Emma. Have a
Take
good
care.
enjoy that little break. Hopefully, you got 2 minutes between.
I have 2 minutes.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
let's enjoy them. Take it easy,
Take
Emma.
care. Bye.